Dad's silent revenge.
My son's future mother-in-law called me worthless trash in front of 200 wedding guests before I could even process the humiliation. I watched my son Brandon look at his bride, see her laughing, and stop the wedding with 5 words that changed everything. "This wedding is over. Everyone leave." The room went dead silent. I thought that moment was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. What we discovered the next morning would destroy a family and expose a scheme so twisted it still makes my blood boil. My name is Tyler Mitchell, and I'm 59 years old. That Saturday morning, I had no idea I was walking into a disaster that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about family. Let me back up a bit so you understand how we got there. I've been a widower for 6 years now. My wife Shane died of a heart attack while we were working together in my workshop behind the house. One minute she was handing me a wrench and laughing at some joke I'd made about the neighbor's dog getting into our garbage again. The next minute she was gone, just collapsed right there between the workbench and the table saw we'd saved up 3 years to buy. Brandon held me while I fell apart at the hospital. He planned the funeral when I couldn't even remember to eat. Made the arrangements, called Shane's sisters in Pennsylvania, handled everything while I sat in that workshop staring at her coffee cup still sitting on the windowsill. After that, it was just him and me against the world. The workshop became my refuge. Shane and I had built it together over 20 years, planning to spend our retirement there, making furniture for the grandkids we hoped we'd have someday and fixing things for the neighbors. Every tool had a story. The router Shane bought me for my 45th birthday. The scroll saw we found at an estate sale and spent a weekend getting running again. The workbench we built from plans Shane drew up herself, measuring twice and cutting once like her dad taught her. It sits on 2 acres of land that's been in my family for 40 years. My dad bought it when land was cheap and nobody wanted to live this far from town. Now developers circle it like vultures, but it's mine, free and clear. Paid off the mortgage the year before Shane died with money from a contracting job that took me away from home for 6 months. She used to joke that the land would be worth more than our marriage if I kept taking jobs like that. So when Brandon met Crystal Manning 2 years ago, I genuinely wanted to like her. She seemed sweet enough at first. Pretty girl with blonde hair and one of those bright smiles you see in toothpaste commercials. Worked in marketing for some company downtown, always dressed nice even when she came over for Sunday dinner. But there were little things that bothered me right from the start. Like how she'd walk through my workshop and wrinkle her nose like something smelled bad. I keep that place clean. Shane made sure of that, and I've kept up her standards. Or how she'd pick at the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon making and say things like, "Tyler, you know they make these really good frozen dinners now that taste almost homemade." Or when she'd suggest Brandon should help me update my living situation now that he was getting serious about someone. Update it how I'd ask. Well, she'd say, maybe it was time I thought about something smaller, more manageable. Maybe one of those nice retirement communities where I wouldn't have to worry about yard work and maintenance. The thing is, I don't want someone else maintaining my life. This house, this workshop, this land, it's not just property. It's where Shane and I plan to grow old together. It's where we were going to teach our grandkids how to use tools properly and show them which trees are good for climbing. Every board in that workshop, every flower Shane planted around the house, every improvement we made together over 25 years of marriage, it all means something. But the real problem wasn't Crystal. It was her mother, Brenda Manning. Brenda was the kind of woman who walked into every room like she owned it and everyone in it owed her rent. Big hair that probably took an hour to get right every morning, expensive clothes that she wore like armor, and loud opinions about everything from politics to the proper way to arrange a dinner table. She was a real estate agent, always talking about properties and investments and who was buying what, where, and for how much. The first time Brandon brought her and Crystal's dad Gary over for dinner, Brenda spent the whole evening evaluating my house like she was already listing it. She'd run her hand along the kitchen counter and say things like, "Original Formica, how charming," in a tone that made charming sound like a disease. She looked around my living room, the furniture Shane and I had bought piece by piece over the years, the family photos on the mantle, the Afghan Shane's mother crocheted for us as a wedding gift, and said, "So this is where Brandon grew up." Interesting. That word, interesting. Same way you describe a car accident or a weird smell you couldn't identify. But I kept my mouth shut because Brandon looked happy, and that was all that mattered to me. Gary seemed like a decent enough guy, actually. Quiet, worked as an electrician, mostly just nodded along with whatever Brenda said. He had these sad eyes like a dog that's been kicked too many times. I felt sorry for him. Marriage shouldn't make you disappear like that. But some women have a way of making their husbands smaller every year until there's nothing left but an echo. Over the next year, Brenda made little comments that got under my skin like splinters you can't quite dig out. "Tyler, have you thought about what happens to all this land when you're gone?" She'd ask while we were sitting around my dinner table. It would be such a shame to see property like this, tied up in probate court while Brandon tries to figure out what to do with it. Or she'd walk around my workshop, picking up tools and setting them down in the wrong places, talking about how much space was being wasted on hobbies when the land could be put to better use. My friend Janet works with a developer who specializes in residential subdivisions, she'd say, running her finger along Shane's workbench like she was checking for dust. They're always looking for good lots in established neighborhoods. We could get you a fair price, help you downsize to something more manageable. Every time she brought up selling, I'd tell her no thanks, I was happy where I was. But she kept pushing like water finding cracks in a foundation. Think about Brandon's future, Tyler. That money could help him and Crystal get started properly. Buy a nice house in town instead of worrying about maintaining all this space. The way she said space made it sound like a disease. Like having room to breathe and work and remember was somehow wrong. Gary would just sit there during these conversations, staring at his hands or out the window, never saying a word. I started wondering if he even had opinions anymore, or if Brenda had worn them all away over the years. The wedding planning started in earnest about 6 months out. Crystal wanted everything perfect, which I understood every girl dreams about her wedding day. But perfect to Crystal seemed to mean expensive, and expensive to Brenda meant opportunity. I offered to help where I could. Paid for the rehearsal dinner without being asked, which set me back $3,200 but seemed like the right thing to do. Spent weeks in the workshop making Crystal a jewelry box from white oak Shane and I had been saving for something special. Hand-cut dovetail joints, brass hinges I ordered special from a catalog, even lined it with velvet Shane had picked out years ago for a project we never got around to finishing. When I gave it to Crystal at her bridal shower, she opened it and said, "Oh, how rustic." The other women cooed and said nice things about the craftsmanship, but I caught the look Brenda shot her daughter. Not appreciation, calculation. 2 weeks before the wedding, something happened that should have been a warning. I came home from the hardware store and found my front door unlocked. I always lock that door, even when I'm just running to town for 20 minutes. Always. It's habit from living alone and having valuable tools in the workshop out back. I checked the house room by room, looking for signs someone had been inside. Nothing seemed obviously missing or out of place, but something felt off. The coffee mug I'd left by the kitchen sink was on the other side, next to the dishwasher. The mail on my desk was stacked differently than I remembered. Small things, things you might miss if you weren't paying attention. The workshop looked normal too, but when I really studied it, I noticed my filing cabinet was open just a crack. I keep my important papers in there, deed to the property. Insurance documents, Shane's death certificate, my will. Everything was still there, but the folders weren't quite in the same order. Maybe I was getting paranoid in my old age, I thought. Maybe I'd just forgotten to lock up, moved things around myself and didn't remember. Stress does funny things to your mind, and wedding planning had everyone on edge. But it nagged at me. That night I called Brandon to tell him about it, just to get it off my chest. "Dad, that's weird," he said. "You want me to come over and check things out?" No, I told him. Probably nothing. Just me being jumpy. "Well, if it happens again, call me right away, okay? And maybe we should think about getting you some security cameras or something." I said sure, we'd talk about it after the wedding. No point stirring up drama when Crystal was already stressed about flowers and catering and whatever other details were keeping her up at night. The wedding was set for the Grand Oak Country Club, a fancy place about 15 minutes from town that I'd driven past 1,000 times but never imagined setting foot in. The parking lot alone was bigger than some people's entire properties, filled with cars that cost more than I made in 2 years when I was still working. Crystal wanted a big wedding, and Brandon said he'd make it happen for her. The guest list kept growing every week. People I'd never heard of, business contacts of Brenda's distant relatives flying in from other states. By the final count, we were looking at almost 200 people. I bought a new suit for the occasion, the first one I'd owned since Shane's funeral. Navy blue wool from the department store, nothing fancy but respectable. Shane always said I looked good in blue, said it brought out my eyes. Standing in that dressing room mirror, adjusting the tie and trying to remember the last time I'd felt this nervous about anything, I wished she could have been there to tell me I looked fine. The morning of the wedding, I got up at 6 a.m. and spent an hour in the workshop just sitting with my coffee and looking around at all the projects Shane and I had worked on together. The rocking chair we'd built for our neighbor's new baby. The kitchen table that took us 3 tries to get the legs even. The hope chest we'd started for Brandon when he was little, thinking maybe someday he'd need it for his own family. Everything in that space held memories of her hands, her voice, her laugh when I'd measure something wrong and have to start over. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear her teasing me about being nervous over a simple wedding. "It's just a party, Tyler," she'd say. "Brandon's happy, that's what matters." She was right, of course. That's all I cared about. My boy was getting married to a girl who made him smile, and that was enough. Everything else was just noise. At least that's what I thought that morning. I had no idea what was waiting for me at the Grand Oak Country Club. The Grand Oak Country Club looked like something from a magazine that morning. White columns stretched up to a roof you could land a helicopter on, with perfectly manicured gardens spreading out in every direction. Valet parking attendants in crisp white shirts directed luxury cars and SUVs into neat rows while staff in bow ties hurried back and forth, carrying flower arrangements the size of small trees. I felt out of place the moment I stepped out of my pickup truck. Every other vehicle in that lot cost more than I'd made in my best year. And here I was in a 10-year-old Ford with paint chips and a toolbox in the back. But Brandon had reserved me a spot right up front. Bless him. So I didn't have to walk too far in my new shoes that were already starting to pinch. Inside, the ballroom looked like a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with cherubs and gold leaf, casting rainbow light across tables covered in white silk and more flowers than you'd see at a funeral for royalty. A string quartet played near the front, and waiters in tuxedos moved through the crowd carrying champagne on silver trays. Brandon looked sharp in his black tuxedo, standing near the altar they'd set up at the front of the room. Nervous energy radiated off him like heat from a wood stove, but he was smiling that same goofy grin he'd had since he was a kid and found a $20 bill in his winter coat pocket. When he saw me, his whole face lit up. "Dad," he came over and hugged me hard enough to wrinkle both our suits. "You clean up pretty good for an old man." "Watch who you're calling old," I said, straightening his bow tie. "You nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted, laughing. "But good terrified, you know?" I knew exactly what he meant. That's how I'd felt the morning I married Shane, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff with wings I'd never tested before. The guests were filing in, and I recognized maybe a quarter of them. Friends from Brandon's work, a few neighbors, some relatives from Shane's side of the family who'd driven down from Pennsylvania. The rest were strangers in expensive clothes, talking quietly among themselves and checking their phones between conversations. I took my seat in the front row on the groom's side, smoothing down my jacket and trying not to think about how much this whole production probably cost. The chair next to me stayed empty. That would have been Shane's seat if the world were fair. I touched the wedding ring I still wore on my left hand and whispered a quick prayer that she could see this somehow. Across the aisle, Brenda Manning held court like a queen receiving tribute. She'd outdone herself for the occasion, wearing a silver dress that caught the light every time she moved and jewelry that probably cost more than my truck. Her hair was piled high enough to require engineering permits, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by professionals. Gary sat beside her in a rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit right, nodding politely at people who came over to congratulate them. He caught my eye once and gave me a small wave, the kind of gesture that said he was as overwhelmed by all this as I was. The music changed and everyone stood. Crystal appeared at the back of the room in a white dress that must have cost more than some people's cars, looking absolutely beautiful. Gary walked her down the aisle with pride written all over his face, and for a moment I forgot all the tension and just felt happy for my son. The ceremony began with all the usual words about love and commitment and building a life together. The officiant was some friend of Brenda's, a man with a voice like warm honey who probably performed weddings for wealthy families every weekend. Everything was going perfectly. Then the flower girl, Crystal's little niece, wandered toward the front row during a pause in the vows. She was maybe 5 years old, wearing a pink dress and carrying a small basket that had scattered rose petals across half the ballroom floor. Kids do unpredictable things at weddings, it's part of their charm. She dropped her basket near my feet and started chasing the loose petals around like they were butterflies. A few guests chuckled softly. I bent down to help her collect them, smiling because there's something about children that makes even the stuffiest occasions feel human again. "Here you go, sweetheart," I whispered, handing her a handful of pink and white petals. That's when Brenda Manning's voice cut through the room like a buzzsaw. "Can you not make everything about yourself for 5 minutes?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Every conversation in that ballroom stopped. The string quartet faltered and went silent. 200 people turned to stare at me, still bent over helping a little girl with flower petals. I froze, petals scattered around my knees, my face burning with sudden shame. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. Brandon's head snapped toward his future mother-in-law, confusion and anger already darkening his features. But Brenda wasn't finished. She stood up in her front row seat, pointing at me with one manicured finger, and delivered the words that would destroy everything. "You're not a father. You're worthless blue-collar trash." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. 200 wedding guests staring. Crystal's little niece looking up at me with wide, confused eyes. The officiant standing frozen with his wedding book open in his hands. And then I heard it, a sound that cut deeper than Brenda's words ever could. Crystal laughed. Not a shocked gasp, not an embarrassed giggle. A real laugh, clear and unmistakable in the deadly quiet of that ballroom. Brandon's head turned toward his bride with the slow, terrible precision of a man watching his world crumble. What's funny about that, Crystal? She tried to cover, tried to turn the laugh into something else, but it was too late. The damage was done. The mask had slipped, and everyone in that room had seen what was underneath. Nothing, she said quickly, her voice suddenly small. I wasn't. My mother was just... Your mother just called my father worthless trash, Brandon said, his voice deadly quiet, and you laughed. The change in my son's expression was something I'd never seen before. All the warmth, all the joy, all the love that had been shining in his face just moments earlier gone, replaced by something cold and final. He looked at me, then at Brenda, then back at Crystal. When he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of that silent ballroom. This wedding is over. Everyone leave. Chaos erupted in that ballroom, like someone had thrown a match into a fireworks factory. Crystal screamed Brandon's name. Brenda started shouting about him being dramatic and ungrateful. Waiting guests jumped to their feet, some heading for the exits, others pulling out their phones to record what was probably the most expensive disaster they'd ever witnessed. But Brandon walked straight through all of it like he was moving underwater. He came to me, took my arm gently, and said, "Come on, Dad. We're leaving." Outside in the parking lot, the evening air hit my burning face like cold water. Brandon was breathing hard, his hands shaking as he loosened his bow tie. I'd never seen him so angry, and that scared me almost as much as what had just happened inside. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I need you to tell me something right now. Has Brenda or Crystal ever said anything to you about selling the house?" The question hit me like ice water. "Why are you asking me that?" He looked back toward the country club, where we could see people streaming out through the front doors, and lowered his voice. "Because yesterday, I found papers in Crystal's overnight bag, and if what I saw is real, this wasn't just about humiliating you in there. They were planning to steal everything after the wedding. Before I could even process that, a car door slammed behind us. Gary Manning was walking toward us across the parking lot, carrying a manila envelope in hands that shook so badly the papers inside rattled. "You two need to see this," he said, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks, "before Brenda gets out here and tries to stop me." Gary opened that envelope right there under the parking lot lights, and my whole world tilted sideways. Property transfer documents with my name on them. Legal papers saying I'd agreed to sell my land and workshop to Manning Development LLC for $150,000, minus less than half what the property was worth. The signature looked like mine, damn close to it anyway, but I knew for certain I'd never signed anything like that. "Where did you get this?" Brandon demanded, his voice dangerous. Gary swallowed hard. "I've been documenting everything for months. Brenda's drowning in debt from failed real estate deals. Credit cards, private loans, a business loan for that boutique she tried to open last year. She owes over $200,000 to various creditors, and they're starting to demand payment." I stared at those forged documents. "I never signed this, I know," Gary said, "but she's been practicing your signature for weeks." "Look." He pulled out his phone and showed us photos, pages and pages covered with my name written over and over in slightly different styles. Brandon went very still, which meant he was furious beyond words. "How did she get his signature to copy?" Gary looked sick. "The Christmas card you sent last year. She kept the envelope, studied your handwriting, practiced until she could forge it well enough to fool a notary." That's when everything clicked into place. The unlocked door, the disturbed filing cabinet. "She was in my house," I said. Gary nodded miserably. 2 weeks ago. She made a copy of your key from Crystal's purse at the rehearsal dinner and had new ones made at the hardware store. She went through all your papers, photographed your important documents, even took some items she thought might be valuable. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not just Brenda, but Crystal too. Crystal had helped them get into my house, into my private papers, into everything Shane and I had built together. What did she take? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Gary pulled out more photos on his phone. Pictures of my desk, my filing cabinet, documents spread across my kitchen table like someone had been conducting an inventory. "She's got copies of your deed, insurance papers, even your medical records, everything she needed to make this fraud look legitimate." Brandon was reading through the transfer documents with the focused intensity of an engineer examining blueprints. "This says the sale was supposed to be finalized next week. Right after the honeymoon, that was the plan," Gary confirmed. "Get you two married, then pressure Tyler into signing by claiming it was family business and Crystal needed security for her future. If he refused, they were going to forge his signature anyway and hope no one questioned it until it was too late. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, and Crystal knew about this. Keith's silence was answer enough. The next morning, Brandon and I drove to my house to assess the full damage. Sure enough, someone had been through everything with the precision of a professional burglar. My important papers were all accounted for but clearly had been photographed. Items were moved, folders reorganized, even my coffee mug was sitting in a different spot on the kitchen counter. But the real kicker was the note we found tucked under my workshop toolbox. Crystal's handwriting, clear as day. Some people never learn their place in the world. That did it for Brandon. He spent the next 3 hours on the phone with lawyers, police detectives, and the county fraud division. By that afternoon, we had a plan. The attorney helped us set up a sting operation. We created fake documents that looked like I was agreeing to the sale, but included deliberate legal errors that would expose anyone trying to file them fraudulently. Then we waited for Brenda to make her move. It didn't take long. 3 days later, she showed up at the county recorder's office with a briefcase full of forged papers, trying to push through the property transfer before anyone could ask too many questions. We watched from across the street as sheriff's deputies arrested her right there in the courthouse parking lot. The look on her face when she realized she'd been caught, shock, rage, and something that might have been fear, was worth every moment of humiliation she'd put me through. Crystal got arrested 4 hours later when they searched her apartment and found the practice signature sheets along with copies of my personal documents. She tried to claim she was just helping her mother with family planning, but the evidence was overwhelming. The trial lasted 6 months. Brenda got 2 years for fraud and forgery. Crystal got 18 months probation and had to pay $25,000 in restitution. Gary testified against his own wife to avoid charges himself, and the whole sorry mess finally came to an end. Brandon never spoke to Crystal again. Can't say I blame him. Trust, once broken like that, doesn't grow back. As for me, I'm still in my house, still working in Shane's workshop. Brandon comes by every Sunday now, and we've started working on projects together, rebuilding that old workbench Shane and I never finished, making a new dining room table from walnut we've been seasoning for 3 years. The property is more secure now. New locks, security cameras, a safe for important documents. But more than that, I've learned something valuable. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who smile while they're doing it. That broken wedding cost Crystal and Brenda everything. But for Brandon and me, it was the day we learned what family really means. Not the people who share your name or sit at your dinner table, but the ones who stand with you when everything falls apart. And sometimes late at night when I'm in the workshop finishing a project Shane would have loved, I think she would have been proud of how we handled it. We didn't let them win. We fought back smart, stayed within the law, and protected what mattered most. That's not a bad legacy for a piece of blue-collar trash like me. Because the truth is, some battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about showing the people you love that you'll stand and fight when it matters most. And that workshop Shane and I built together, it's not just wooden tools anymore. It's proof that honest work and family loyalty can outlast any scheme, no matter how clever or cruel.